Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Bava Basra, Daf Samachtal, Bava Basra 64, and we're going to start on 64a on the third line. The Daf is dedicated for Yeshua for the Chayalim, Hatzalah for the Shvuyim, Shmira for Am Yisrael, and his Eis Tzara. So the Daf Yomi tells us on Samachtal and Aleph. Now we're discussing the halacha that Rav Dimi said. Rav Dimi had said on 63b that if for some reason you sell your house to your friend, even though you wrote, I'm selling it to you with the depths and the heights, kavaruma, that just means that you're including the right to tunnel and the airspace, but it doesn't mean you're including the wells. The assumption of the Gemara is that Rav Dimi says this because if you don't write it, you haven't sold the tunneling and the airspace. So you need to write I'm selling you the Varuma, otherwise it's not included. So the Gemara says, I'll bring you a proof that Rav Dimi is incorrect. That if you don't write it, you're still including the airspace and the tunnels, the tunneling rights, even though it's not included. I'm going to say that that's halacha, not like Rav Dimi. Because we had a statement that Reish Lakish said, Tashma, that Reish Lakish himself, they say Tashma, that Reish Lakish himself said, Zosomeres, that Reish Lakish had learned in response to a brisa that said that the Levite can sell his field and hold back the rights to his meiser, that he gets that. Zosomeres, we learned from here, says Reish Lakish, Amlochar Bayis Lechavero, one who sells a field to his friend and he says, on the condition that I retain the upper roof, or he's in fact retained the rights to the upper roof. But why does he need to even say that? Says the Gemara on Reish Lakish. Anyways, we know that it said in the Mishnah that if you sell a property, you have not included the rooftop. The rooftop was a separate structure. Rav Zvid said it's to teach us that if he wants to, good morning, Eric, if he wants to have protrusions coming out of the house, he can. And Rav Papa says, Rav Papa's telling us that he has the right to rebuild it. So why does it need to say this phrase, Amanas, Shadiyuta al Yona Shali? So what's Reish Lakish teaching us? Reish Lakish is teaching us that he has the rights to according to Rav Zvid, he has the right to the airspace, and according to Rav Papa, he has the rights to rebuild on it. And if you want to say, like Rav Dimi, that as a baseline, you have not acquired the airspace, that you have to include it, then lamali amanas. And why would he need to say this cause of amanas? Meaning to say, according to Rav Papa, he's saying that since it's extra, because it's included, therefore this extra clause is to teach us the idea that you can rebuild it. But according to Rav Dimi, it's not included. So you needed to teach us the rights to the airspace. So therefore, the Gemara says, no, Rav Dimi would say, it's letting you rebuild it. Okay, so now we're on to the Mishnah on 64a, and the Mishnah tells us the following. Here we're going to talk about easements. What's the assumption if you sell a property? Do we assume that you sold the easement along with it, or does the easement have to be specifically stipulated? An easement is a limited usage of a property, and so that's what the Gemara is discussing. It says in our Mishnah that if you sold the house, loas abor v'loas hadus, you have not included the well, or the bor and the deuce are two types of wells. You have not included them in the sale. You haven't included the well. So I sell you my house, but I have a well on the property. I didn't say I'm selling you the well, so it's not included. And Afal Pisha Kosavo Umkuvarumo, even though he wrote, I'm selling you the Umkuvarumo, like we just discussed, that doesn't refer to the well. That refers to the tunneling rights and the airspace rights. And now here's what we're going to discuss for the rest of the daf. The Tzerach Likacho Derech, Divrei Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva says, now the person who sold the well, so Reuven sold the house to Shimon. He did not sell the well, like we just said. But now Reuven doesn't have the house, but he still has the well. How is he going to get to the well? How is he going to walk down the path to get to the well? So Rabbi Akiva says he needs to buy the well. He needs to buy an easement back. We assume that he did not sell the easement. He did not retain an easement. He sold everything, and now he has to buy back from the purchaser a path to get to the well. The Chachamim say, no, we do not assume that he sold the rights to an easement, and so he still has an easement to get to his well. Umode Rabbi Akiva, bizman she'amar lo chutz mi'elu she'ein tzarich lekach derech. But Rabbi Akiva would admit that if he says, I'm selling you the house, but not the well, then Rabbi Akiva would admit he doesn't need to buy an easement. Why? Because the phrase, and not the well, is not necessary. It's an extra phrase, because anyways, we assume that if you sell the house, you're not selling the well. So why would he include the phrase, and not the well? Only to teach us this basic idea that he has a right to an easement. But now we have another case where we're going to see the positions are reversed. Machran la'acher, that let's say Reuven owned a house and a well, and Reuven sold the well to somebody else. Rabbi Akiva Omer Eino Tzarich Lekacho Derech. Rabbi Akiva says the person who he sold it to does not need to buy an easement. We assume that he sold the well with the easement, so that guy does not need to buy an easement. Chachamim say no, he needs to buy an easement, and the Gemara is going to discuss this case. But first, we'll go through a technical situation. What's a bor and a deuce? What's the difference? Yosef Ravina v'kakashile hainu bor hainu deuce. Ravina was bothered by this, and he said, "Well, what's the difference between a bor and a deuce? What do you mean? Just a technical." Ravina and Ravashi were the last generation of the Talmud, so they maybe were discussing the language of the Mishnah, and they were further away from it. So they said, "What's the difference between the bor and the deuce?" So I'm like Rava Tusfa. His name is Rava Tusfa. The word Tosfa means added on. So someone to say that Rava Tusfa was adding on to Ravina. He came after the end of the Talmud. He was adding on teachings to the Talmud that were all after the Talmud was already edited. So Amalei Rava Tusfa Ravina Tashma the Tanya Echad Bor ve'Echad Dus Bekarka. Now both the bor and the deuce are basically pits in the ground. But the bor though is just by digging down and you have earth around it, and the deuce is with like bricks. Okay. Yosef Rav Ashi the Kakashu Hainu bor Hainu deuce. Rav Ashi was sitting there, he had the same question. The bor is the deuce. Amroi Markashicha Bered Rav Chisda Rav Ashi Tashman Tanya Echad Bor Echad Adus Bekarko Shabor Bechafir Rav Adus Bebinyan. Okay, same idea. So now we get into the meat of the daf. Tzarach Lekacho Derech Divrei Rabbi Akiva v'Chamim Omrim Eino Tzarach. The Gemara says, okay, again to review, talking about a case where you sold your house, but you retained the well. Rabbi Akiva says you now need to buy an easement, and the Chachamim say you don't. What are they arguing about? So the Gemara on the top of 64b, I'll tell you what they're arguing about. Rabbi Akiva Savar Mocher Ba'in Yafa Mocher Rabbanan Savri mocher ba'ayin ra mocher. And this is a fundamental dispute, and perhaps it goes to a much deeper issue. Rabbi Akiva says we assume, let's say all things being equal and the contract is not clear, we assume the seller was as generous as possible with the sale. He sold as much as possible. So in this case, we assume that the seller sold the easement as well. He sold as much as possible. He was sold it with a nice, generous eye. Whereas the Rabbanan are of the position, mocher ba'ayin ra mocher, that he sold it, that the seller wants to retain everything for himself as much as possible. So that's the dispute. So since Rabbi Akiva says he sold a generous eye, he sold the easement. Chum say no, he sold with a tight eye, so he didn't sell the easement. You had a question, Meyer?
He was consistent with
Ah.
And the Rabbanim are political scientific.
Meyer just said Meyer was brilliant here, and I was about to say what I saw from somebody else, but Meyer got it right away. I hopped it right away. That Rabbi Akiva, he's the optimist throughout the Shas. He's the one who always looks at he's the one who always looks at the bright side of life, and he looks at the bright side of people. Rabbi Akiva says, love your neighbor like you love yourself. Rabbi Akiva says, we're going to see the rebuilding of the temple. Rabbi Akiva says, even when he's in prison, I'm here for, this is what I was created to do, to teach Torah. Rabbi Akiva was never down. So he looks at a guy, he says, of course he wants to do the right thing. He sold it with a generous eye. But as Meyer said it so appropriately, the Rabbanan, they're like the cold, calculated reality of life. That's the majority of people. And in this case, it is interesting that we paskin like Rabbi Akiva. We paskin like Rabbi Akiva. So,
encounter the people kumbaya movement or combat. Looks more like combat.
Well, we paskin like Rabbi Akiva though. So, yeah. Anyway, it's always it's a very beautiful thing. Here we have a little argument about an easement, but it turns into a deeper philosophical point. So the Gemara says, hold on one second. So the Gemara says, the Kamrina Nami Ba'alma Rabbi Akiva Watameh. And in general, in other places in the Shas, when we discuss sale, this is this same dispute between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan. We already had this case once earlier in our tractate where Daf Lamed Zayin, where if a person sold two trees and he left the area in between, Rabbi Akiva says no, he sold the land in between the trees, and the Rabbanan say he didn't. So here too, this is the same dispute. The Rabbi Akiva Savar, Rabbi Akiva Tamei Damar Mocher Bayin Yafa Mocher Me'acha, and this is the source for Rabbi Akiva's position that when you sell something, you're selling it with a generous eye. The Gemara says, wait, why do we have to say that? Mimai. How do we know that this dispute about the easements, Rabbi Akiva said the seller sold the easements, and the Rabbanan say he didn't? How do we know it's really related to the same idea of Mocher Bayin Yafa Mocher? How do we know that? Dilma Rabbi Akiva Savar, Ein Adam Rotza Shitei Ma'osav V'Yirdesu Acherim. Maybe it's just very specific to this case. Rabbi Akiva maybe on the position that the purchaser doesn't want to give his money. I'm buying this whole yard, and now you have the right to walk through my yard whenever you want. He's not going to do that. Rabbanan Savri, Ein Adam Rotza Sheital Mos V'Yifrach Ba'avir. And the Rabbanan say a person, and it's also the Rabbanan who says that he didn't sell the easement. It's because the person doesn't want you take my money, and now I have to get there by flying in the air. Meaning to say, he's going to take the money, and now, okay, I retain this rights, but the only way I can get there is by flying in the air. So maybe it's just a case specific and not a general principle. the Rabbanan's statement here that a person doesn't want to have to fly through the air to get to his property implies that there's no other way for the seller to get to his well other than flying in the air. There's literally no way to get there. And that's the way the Yad Ramah, the Rishon, learns this situation, that he sold and he had zero means of access. But the Rashash, who is a businessman, says, no, that's not possible, that you could sell and have no access. He has a way of access just through great difficulty. So, and Rashash has to be bothered by this phrase, a little difficult, but I guess he would have to understand in a more general sense. But it's also problematic. So I was thinking, but nowadays we know that you can access it through the air. Sometimes the Gemara talks about situations through the air, like, for example, is he going to travel there on a donkey? Or how's he going to get there? We had that situation. We now know that you can travel in the air. So let's say you don't have an easement on the ground, but you do have an easement by parachuting in. So is that considered like you have no easement also? So we see from here that if you have to get through the air, that's not considered to be an easement. So the Gemara says, Ella Miseifa. Maybe the fact that this is part of a larger dispute between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan is learned out from the next clause, the second clause of the Mishnah, which says, Machran la'acher, that if you sold it, just the well to somebody else. So Rabbi Akiva says, Eino tzarach l'kacho derech. Rabbi Akiva says, under those circumstances, you do not need to that if you sold the well to somebody else, that person does not need to acquire an easement, because for sure he bought the easement because you sold it to him with a generous eye. Some say no, you do need to buy an easement because he didn't sell to him with a generous eye. So maybe that's a dispute. Maybe that's a source of the idea that Rabbi Akiva says you sell with a generous eye and the Rabbanan say you don't. Gemara says no, not necessarily the case. Again, maybe it's just a case-specific argument. Maybe they're only arguing about the fact that Rabbi Akiva sagvar basar daita d'lokeach azlinan, Rabbanan savar basar daita d'mocher azlinan. Do we look at it from the perspective of the seller, that Rabbi Akiva's of the position, that we look at it from the perspective of the purchaser? He intended to buy the easement, and the Rabbanan say, no, we're looking at it from the perspective of the seller, and he didn't intend to sell the easement. So the Gemara still hasn't found the source, the proof that this is part of a larger dispute. Rabbi Akiva says you sell with a generous eye, and the Rabbanan say you don't. Ela meha. So it's rather from this case. It says in the Mishnah, Loas Abor Veloas Agat. This is the coming up Mishnah. We haven't done it yet, but we're going to get to it soon, God willing. That if you sell a field, you have not sold the well or the gat. The gat is the wine press. Veloas Shovach. You haven't sold the dovecote. Bain Chareven, Bain Yeshuvin. And you haven't sold it to them. You haven't sold it whether they are dry or whether meaning to say whether there's no water in the well and there's no grapes in the vines and there's no doves in the dovecote, or Bain Yeshuvin, or whether they're full. I mean to say whether there's water and there's grapes. Meaning to say you haven't sold the wells. When you sell the field, you haven't sold the well. And so therefore the person who sold the field, now he has to get to his well and his dovecote and his grapevine, now needs to purchase an easement. So that's the position of Rabbi Akiva. It must be mocher b'ayin yafa mocher. He sold it with a generous eye. So say you don't need to purchase an easement because now why do we need to say this case again? If you sell your well, we just had the case in our Mishnah if you sold your well in a house. Now we're saying if you sold your well in a field, it's the same case. And it must be that it's to teach us the larger principle. Isn't it to teach us the larger principle? The Rabbi Kiva says you sell with a generous eye, and the Rabbanan say you sell with a stingy eye. Where it says no. No, maybe it's because it's two separate scenarios. Our first Mishnah is talking about where you sold your house and you retained the well. And this next Mishnah is talking about where you sold the field and you retained the well. And they're arguing about the easement in both cases. And we need it to be taught in both cases. If you want to just say in the case of the house, there we would say that Rabbi Akiva says you sold the easement mishum debayit niusa, because the person who bought the house, we assume, he's not going to want you walking through his backyard. So he bought the easements as well, and you don't have an easement. Aval sada, but a field, maybe there's no privacy there, so you could assume that he's not blocking your easement. And if we just had the case where he sold the field and now we say he needs to purchase an easement, we would say mishum dekashule davsha, because the guy who bought the field doesn't want you trampling on his property because it's bad for his vegetables. Dekashule davsha. We already had this word davsha. We had a case once before in Bava Basra where the person was trampling around the wall to make it stronger. Aval bias, but if it's a case of a house where there's no issue about the trampling, he doesn't care about the trampling, we might say under those circumstances, he has not retained all the land, and he'll give you the easement. So therefore, that can't be the source. So what's the source for the idea? Rabbi Kiva says you sold with a generous eye. Elami Seifa, from the next clause. From the next clause in the Mishnah, Rabbi Kiva, let's say you went and you sold the well, which is in somebody else's field, to somebody else. Rabbi Kiva says, Rabbi Kiva says you don't need to purchase. That person does not need to purchase the easement. We assume he sold it to him. And isn't this the exact same case as the case of the house? So this is the source. It's the second clause of the coming Mishnah on Ayin Aleph that tells us this basic idea that Rabbi Kiva says you sell with a generous eye, and the Rabbanan say we assume the assumption is that you sold with a stingy eye. We have here with us Eric, and Eric is an attorney. I'm wondering, Eric, do you know what the baseline was in American courts? I didn't mean to put you on the spot. So we'll hopefully Noam will come for the next staff. Noam is a real estate lawyer, and we'll ask him. The assumption is for the seller or the purchaser. It's probably going to depend upon the state. If you go to a state like where the landlords control the legislature, you'll get one thing. But everybody's always buying and selling. So one time you're a buyer, one time you're a seller. So that's that. Ravuna Amarav. Ravuna said in the name of Rav, halacha. You see, when you show up to the daf, you need to bring your real estate code so you could paskin for us. And so it says Ravuna in the name of Rav, halacha k'divrei chachamim. The law is like the chachamim who say that we're on top of 65a and you sell with a stingy eye, ayin ra. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says in the name of Shmuel, halacha k'Rabbi Akiva. The law is like Rabbi Akiva who says you sell with an ayin yafeh. Amalei Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Rav Huna. How can it be that the law is like so? So basically, Rav Huna said in the name of Rav that the law is like the Chachamim. So Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says to Rav Huna, "Vazimnan sagin amrinan kamei de Rav helchasak Rabbi Akiva." How could you have said that in the name of Rav the law is like the Chachamim? Presumably that's Mochar Bayin Ra, but sometimes you quoted to us in front of Rav. In front of Rav, I said in front of Rav. I was in front of Rab, and I said that the law is like Rabbi Akiva, and he didn't say anything to me. So Rav Huna said to Rav Yirmiyah, how did you teach it in front of Rav? I taught it the opposite, meaning to say I said in the name of Rabbi Akiva, Mochar Bayin Ra. But really, we know our Mishnah that Rabbi Akiva is teaching Mochar Bayin Yafa, but I taught him Mochar Bayin Ra. That's why I didn't say anything to you. But anyway, however, it's interesting. We're going to see from the Maskanas of the Gemara that Rav Nachman Paskins like Shmuel says Mocher Bayin Yafeh. So even though Rav rules like the Rabbanan or the version of Rabbi Akiva that says Mocher Bayin Ra, we Paskin like Shmuel and his version of Rabbi Akiva, which is Mocher Bayin Yafeh, that you sell with a generous eye. Okay.